Welcome back, brave soul. The world outside may be quiet, but in here, things are just beginning to stir. Before we descend into tonight's unsettling tale, tell me, are you listening with the lights off, or do you need a little glow to keep the fear at bay? Leave a comment, tap like if you enjoy that creeping tension before sleep, and hit subscribe if you're hungry for more stories that whisper in the dark. Now, get comfortable, but not too comfortable, because this story might just follow you into your dreams. Story 1. Working as a bartender in downtown Chicago seemed like the perfect job for me back in 2018. The pay was decent, the tips were good, and I genuinely enjoyed meeting new people every night. Murphy's Irish pub had been around for decades, tucked between a vintage bookstore and a small bakery on a quiet street that came alive after dark. The building itself was old, probably from the 1920s, with exposed brick walls, dark wooden beams, and that authentic worn-in feel that couldn't be faked. I'd been working there for about 6 months when things started getting weird. At first, it was just small stuff that I brushed off as coincidence or my imagination running wild during those late-night shifts. Glasses would be in different spots than where I'd left them. The temperature would drop suddenly for no reason. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps upstairs in what was supposed to be an empty storage area. My manager, Tom, was this gruff guy in his 50s who'd been running Murphy's for over 20 years. When I mentioned the strange occurrences to him, he'd just laugh it off and tell me I was spending too much time around drunk people and their ghost stories. But I noticed something in his eyes when I talked about it, like he knew more than he was letting on. The first really unsettling incident happened on a Tuesday night in October. Tuesdays were usually dead, especially after midnight, so I was alone behind the bar with just 3 customers nursing their drinks in different corners of the pub. The old jukebox in the corner had been playing classic rock all evening, but suddenly it switched to this slow, haunting melody I'd never heard before. The song was completely different from anything else on that machine. It sounded like it was from the 1940s, with a woman singing in a language I couldn't identify. I walked over to check it out, thinking maybe someone had fed it quarters and selected something weird. But when I got there, the display showed that no song was selected, and there was no money in the slot. The music just kept playing, getting louder and more distorted with each passing minute. One of my customers, an older guy who came in every Tuesday, looked at me with wide eyes and asked if I was playing some kind of joke on him. I unplugged the jukebox from the wall, but the music didn't stop. It kept playing for another full minute before finally fading away into silence. The 3 customers left shortly after that, leaving me alone with a machine that had somehow played music without power. I spent the rest of my shift avoiding that corner of the pub. When I told Tom about it the next day, he got this look on his face that I'd never seen before. He was quiet for a long moment, then told me that the jukebox had belonged to the previous owner of the building. Apparently, it had some sentimental value, so they'd kept it when Murphy's took over the space in the late 1990s. He didn't elaborate, but something about the way he said it made me think there was a lot more to that story. Things escalated quickly after the jukebox incident. The next week, I started seeing someone in my peripheral vision while I was working. It was always the same figure, a woman in what looked like a 1940s dress, standing near the back corner where we kept the extra chairs stacked up. Every time I'd turn to get a better look, she'd be gone. But I could swear I caught glimpses of dark hair and pale skin, and sometimes I'd smell perfume that didn't match anything any of my customers were wearing. The other bartenders started noticing things too. Sarah, who worked the weekend shifts, mentioned that she'd been finding the front door unlocked in the mornings, even though she was certain she'd locked it the night before. Mike, who covered Thursday nights, said he'd been hearing someone walking around upstairs during his shifts, but when he'd go check, there was never anyone there. We started comparing notes, and a pattern emerged. All of these incidents were happening more frequently, and they seemed to be centered around the back corner of the pub where I'd been seeing the woman. That area had always felt a little colder than the rest of the bar, but now it was noticeably frigid. Customers would unconsciously avoid sitting at those tables, even on busy nights when seating was limited. I decided to do some research on the building's history. The local library had old city records and newspaper archives that went back decades. What I found made my blood run cold. The building had indeed housed a bar in the 1940s called the Blue Moon Lounge. In 1947, a young woman named Eleanor Hartwell had been murdered there under mysterious circumstances. According to the newspaper articles I found, Eleanor was a regular at the Blue Moon. She was in her mid-20s, worked as a secretary downtown, and lived alone in a small apartment a few blocks away. On the night of her death, she'd been at the bar as usual, sitting in her favorite spot in the back corner and listening to music on the jukebox. The bartender remembered her selecting the same song over and over, some foreign tune that she said reminded her of her grandmother. The details of her murder were disturbing. She'd been found the next morning by the cleaning lady, slumped over her table in that back corner. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious wounds, and no witnesses. The coroner's report was inconclusive. They couldn't determine a cause of death. The case went cold within a few months, and the Blue Moon Lounge closed permanently not long after. Reading about Eleanor's death sent chills down my spine, especially when I realized that her favorite table was in the exact spot where I'd been seeing the mysterious woman. The song she'd been playing on the jukebox the night she died matched the description of the haunting melody I'd heard that Tuesday night. Everything was starting to make a horrible kind of sense. I brought my research to Tom, hoping he'd finally level with me about what was going on. He read through the newspaper clippings with a grim expression, then sat back in his chair and rubbed his temples. After a long silence, he admitted that he'd known about Eleanor's story for years. The previous owner had told him about it when he bought the place, but he'd hoped that renovating the space and changing the atmosphere would put whatever was happening to rest.
"She's never hurt anyone," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In all the years I've been here, she's never done anything truly dangerous. Just reminders that she's still around. I figured as long as we left her alone, she'd leave us alone." But Tom was wrong. Eleanor wasn't content to just coexist with us anymore. Something had changed, and her presence was becoming more aggressive and harder to ignore. The breaking point came on a Saturday night in November. The pub was packed with the usual weekend crowd. College students, young professionals, couples on dates. The atmosphere was lively and loud, with conversations and laughter drowning out the background music. I was behind the bar, mixing drinks and chatting with customers, when the temperature in the pub suddenly plummeted. It wasn't a gradual change. It was like someone had opened a massive freezer door. Within seconds, everyone's breath was visible in the air. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people looked around in confusion, pulling their jackets tighter and asking if the heat had broken. But this wasn't a mechanical failure. This was something else entirely. The lights began to flicker, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The jukebox, which had been playing normally all evening, suddenly switched to that same haunting melody I'd heard weeks earlier. But this time, it was much louder, drowning out every other sound in the pub. Some customers covered their ears and started heading for the door. Then I saw her clearly for the first time. Eleanor was standing in the back corner, no longer just a glimpse in my peripheral vision. She was wearing a navy blue dress with a white collar, her dark hair styled in victory rolls typical of the 1940s. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were fixed directly on me. She looked exactly like the photograph I'd found in the old newspaper article about her death. But what terrified me wasn't her appearance, it was the expression on her face. She looked angry, desperate, and deeply sad all at once. Her mouth was moving as if she was trying to say something, but no sound was coming out over the deafening music from the jukebox. The other customers were starting to panic. Some were pushing toward the exit while others stood frozen in place, staring at Eleanor in shock and disbelief. A woman at the bar next to me grabbed my arm and asked in a shaking voice if I was seeing what she was seeing. I could only nod, unable to find my voice. Eleanor raised her hand and pointed directly at me, her mouth still moving silently. The jukebox music grew even louder, the lights flickered more violently, and several glasses behind the bar shattered simultaneously.
That's when the screaming started. People were trampling over each other to get out of the pub. Chairs were overturned, drinks were spilled, and within minutes the place was nearly empty except for me, Eleanor, and a handful of customers who seemed too stunned to move. I stood there behind the bar, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, trying to understand what Eleanor wanted from me. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The music cut off, the lights steadied, and the temperature returned to normal. Eleanor was gone. The only evidence of what had happened was the broken glass behind the bar and the overturned furniture scattered throughout the pub. I called Tom immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial his number. He arrived within 20 minutes, took one look at the chaos, and closed the pub for the rest of the night. We spent the next hour cleaning up and trying to make sense of what had happened. "She's getting stronger," Tom said as we swept up the broken glass. "This is the worst it's ever been. Something's changed, and I don't think ignoring her is going to work anymore." The next few days were tense. Word about the incident had spread quickly through the neighborhood, and some of our regular customers were too spooked to come back. The local newspaper even ran a small article about the disturbance at Murphy's, though they attributed it to a gas leak that had caused hallucinations. Tom went along with that story publicly, but privately we both knew the truth was far stranger. I started having dreams about Eleanor. In them, she would appear in my bedroom, standing at the foot of my bed with that same desperate expression. She would try to speak, but her voice was always just out of reach, like hearing someone whisper from another room. I would wake up exhausted and anxious, dreading another shift at the pub, but I couldn't quit. Despite everything that had happened, I felt a strange sense of responsibility. Eleanor had chosen to reveal herself to me more than anyone else. She'd pointed at me during that chaotic Saturday night. There was something she wanted me to understand, and I couldn't shake the feeling that walking away would only make things worse. I decided to try communicating with her directly. It sounds crazy now, but at the time it seemed like the only logical next step. I started staying after my shifts, sitting alone in the empty pub and trying to sense her presence. I would talk out loud, telling her that I knew her story and asking what she wanted from us. For several nights, nothing happened. But on the fourth night, as I sat at the bar, nursing a beer and talking to the empty room, I felt that familiar drop in temperature. Eleanor appeared slowly, like she was materializing out of the shadows in the back corner. This time, she looked calmer, less agitated than before. She walked slowly toward the bar, and I forced myself to stay seated and not run. When she was about 10 feet away, she stopped and looked directly into my eyes. Her mouth moved, and this time I could hear her voice, faint and distant, like an old radio transmission through static. "Find the truth," she whispered. "They covered it up. Find what really happened." Before I could respond, she faded away, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. But at least now I had some direction. Eleanor wasn't just haunting the pub randomly. She wanted someone to uncover the real story behind her death. I threw myself into research with renewed determination. I spent hours at the library, combing through police records, court documents, and newspaper archives from 1947 and the years that followed. Most of the official records had been sanitized or were missing entirely, but I eventually found some leads in unlikely places. An elderly librarian named Mrs. Patterson remembered the case and mentioned that her late husband had been a police officer at the time. She still had some of his personal files and boxes in her attic, and she agreed to let me look through them. What I found there changed everything I thought I knew about Eleanor's death. According to Officer Patterson's notes, Eleanor hadn't been a random victim. She'd been having an affair with a married city councilman named Robert Hayes. Hayes was a prominent figure in local politics, with aspirations for higher office and a reputation to protect. When Eleanor threatened to expose their relationship, he'd apparently decided to silence her permanently. The night of her death, Hayes had met Eleanor at the Blue Moon Lounge. Officer Patterson's notes suggested that Hayes had poisoned Eleanor's drink with something that would cause cardiac arrest, a method that would be difficult to detect with the forensic technology available in 1947. Hayes had connections throughout the police department and city government, and he'd used his influence to ensure that the investigation was quietly dropped. Eleanor had been murdered not by a random stranger, but by someone she trusted, someone who had used her feelings for him to lure her to her death. The injustice of it all made me sick to my stomach, but it also gave me a sense of purpose. She'd been trying to tell someone the truth for over 70 years, and finally, someone was listening. The problem was that Robert Hayes had died in 1983, taking his secrets with him to the grave. There was no legal recourse, no way to bring him to justice posthumously. But I realized that wasn't necessarily what Eleanor wanted. She just wanted someone to know the truth, to acknowledge what had really happened to her. The next night I returned to the pub after closing and sat in Eleanor's favorite spot in the back corner. I brought Officer Patterson's notes with me and read them aloud, explaining everything I'd discovered about Robert Hayes and the cover-up that had followed her murder. Eleanor appeared almost immediately, but this time she looked different. The anger and desperation were gone from her face, replaced by something that looked like relief. She stood listening as I told her story, nodding occasionally as if confirming details I'd gotten right. When I finished reading, she smiled, the first time I'd seen any expression other than sadness or anger on her face. She walked closer to me, and I could see tears on her cheeks. She mouthed the words, "Thank you," and then she began to fade away. But this time was different. As she disappeared, the oppressive cold that had always accompanied her presence lifted from the pub. The back corner, which had been frigid for months, warmed to match the rest of the room. The jukebox, which had been acting erratically for weeks, went completely silent and stayed that way. Eleanor was gone, and this time I knew she wasn't coming back. I wrote up everything I'd discovered and gave copies to Tom, Mrs. Patterson, and the local historical society. It wasn't much, but it was something. Eleanor's story would be part of the official record now, even if justice had come 70 years too late. Murphy's returned to normal after that night. The strange incidents stopped completely, and the pub felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the entire building. Customers gradually returned, drawn by the comfortable atmosphere and good drinks, unaware that they were now sharing the space with only the living. I continued working at Murphy's for another year before eventually moving on to other opportunities. But I'll never forget my time there, or the woman who trusted me with her story. Sometimes I think about Eleanor and wonder if she found peace after finally being heard, after finally having someone acknowledge the injustice of her death. Working in bars, you meet all kinds of people and hear all kinds of stories. Most of them are forgotten by the next day, lost in the haze of alcohol and late-night conversation. But some stories stick with you, especially when they come from someone who's been waiting over 7 decades to tell them. The building that houses Murphy's Irish pub is still there on that quiet Chicago street. Tom retired a few years ago, and new management took over, but the place maintains its authentic, worn-in atmosphere. The jukebox still sits in the corner, though it only plays the songs that are actually programmed into it now. If you ever find yourself there on a quiet Tuesday night, take a look at the back corner where the extra chairs are stacked. It's warmer there now, welcoming instead of forbidding. Sometimes I like to think that Eleanor's presence didn't entirely disappear, that she just transformed from a tormented spirit into something more benevolent, watching over the place where she spent her final living moments. The truth about her death may have taken decades to surface, but justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's simply about acknowledgement, about ensuring that someone's story doesn't get lost to time and corruption. Eleanor Hartwell was murdered by someone she trusted, and her case was covered up by people who valued political careers over human life. But she wasn't forgotten. Her story survived, passed down through whispered conversations and unexplained incidents, until finally someone was willing to listen and dig deeper. That's the real horror of what happened at Murphy's, not the ghostly encounters or supernatural phenomena, but the very human evil that created them in the first place. The experience taught me that sometimes the dead aren't trying to scare us, they're trying to communicate something important. Eleanor's haunting wasn't random or malicious, it was purposeful. She was trying to tell her story to anyone who would listen, hoping that eventually someone would care enough to seek out the truth. I still bartend occasionally, though I've never encountered anything quite like what happened at Murphy's. But the experience made me a better listener, more attuned to the stories that people carry with them. Everyone who sits at a bar has a story to tell, and most of them just want someone to listen without judgment. Eleanor's story was darker than most, involving betrayal, murder, and corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government. But at its core, it was the story of a young woman who fell in love with the wrong person and paid the ultimate price for it. She deserved better than she got in life, and she deserved to have her story told truthfully after death. The paranormal incidents at Murphy's were real, I'm certain of that. Too many people witnessed them for it all to be imagination or suggestion. But the true horror wasn't in the supernatural elements. It was in the very ordinary human capacity for evil that had created the situation in the first place.
Robert Hayes was probably a charming man who knew how to manipulate people's emotions for his own gain. He likely convinced Eleanor that he loved her, that he would leave his wife for her, that they had a future together. When she became inconvenient, he eliminated her with the same calculated coldness that he probably applied to his political career. The cover-up that followed her death was equally disturbing. Multiple people had to have been involved in suppressing the investigation, from police officers to city officials to newspaper editors. Eleanor's life was considered expendable compared to Hayes' political ambitions and the reputation of the city government.
That kind of corruption still exists today, though hopefully not to the same extent. People in power still sometimes believe they can make inconvenient problems disappear, whether through legal manipulation, financial influence, or simply waiting for public attention to move elsewhere. Eleanor's story is a reminder that sometimes those problems don't stay buried, that truth has a way of surfacing even decades later. The most disturbing aspect of the whole experience was realizing how close Eleanor's story came to being lost forever. If Tom had been more successful in ignoring the supernatural incidents, if I hadn't been curious enough to research the building's history, if Mrs. Patterson hadn't kept her husband's old files, any of those factors could have changed the outcome entirely. How many other stories like Eleanor's are out there, locked away in old buildings or forgotten in dusty archives? How many people died under suspicious circumstances, only to have their cases buried by people with the power and influence to rewrite history? The thought keeps me awake sometimes, wondering about all the untold stories of injustice that will never see the light of day. But Eleanor's story did surface eventually. Her voice was finally heard, her truth finally acknowledged. That has to count for something, even if it came 70 years too late. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for, that our stories will matter to someone, that we won't be forgotten entirely when we're gone. Working at Murphy's taught me that the line between the living and the dead isn't as clear as we like to think. Eleanor's presence in that pub was as real as any of the customers who came in for drinks and conversation. She had needs and desires just like any living person. She wanted to be heard, to be understood, to have her story told accurately. The supernatural elements of her haunting were just tools she used to get attention, to make people notice that something was wrong. The cold temperatures, the malfunctioning jukebox, the glimpses of her figure in the shadows, all of it was designed to create enough disturbance that someone would eventually ask the right questions. In the end, the real horror story wasn't about a ghost haunting a bar. It was about a young woman whose life was cut short by greed and ambition, whose death was covered up by corrupt officials, and whose story was nearly lost to time. The supernatural elements were just the delivery method for a very human tale of betrayal and injustice. Eleanor Hartwell deserved better than she got in life, but at least her story finally got the ending it deserved. Someone listened, someone cared enough to dig for the truth, and someone made sure that her memory wouldn't be lost. That's not the same as justice, but sometimes acknowledgement is the closest thing to justice that we can achieve. If you ever find yourself in a place that feels haunted, remember that there might be a story behind the supernatural incidents. Someone might be trying to communicate something important, something that got buried along with their body. The real horror often lies not in the ghostly encounters themselves, but in the very human events that created them. Eleanor's story is finally told, her truth finally acknowledged. The back corner of Murphy's Irish pub is warm and welcoming now, no longer carrying the weight of unresolved injustice. But her memory lives on in the historical record, a reminder that every life has value and every story deserves to be heard, even if it takes 7 decades for someone to listen. Story 2. I've been babysitting since I was 15 years old. It was always easy money. Watch some kids, make sure they don't burn the house down, earn enough cash for movies and clothes. In 4 years of babysitting, I'd never had a truly scary experience. Sure, there were the usual things, kids who wouldn't go to sleep, toddlers who tried to eat everything, the occasional power outage, but nothing that actually frightened me. That all changed on a cold February night when I was 19. I'd been hired to watch the Morrison kids, twin 7-year-olds named Emma and Ethan, while their parents went to a wedding reception. It was supposed to be a simple evening job. Put the kids to bed by 8, watch TV, do some homework, and collect my $60 when the parents got home around midnight. The Morrison house was one of those big colonial homes in the expensive part of town. 3 stories, probably built in the 1960s with a long driveway and no close neighbors. I'd babysat there twice before and always felt comfortable. The kids were well behaved, the parents were nice, and the house had every luxury you could imagine. Big screen TV, fully stocked kitchen, even a game room in the basement. Mrs. Morrison met me at the door when I arrived at 6 p.m. She looked beautiful in her evening dress, but I could tell she was stressed about leaving the kids. First-time parents always are, even when their children are 7 years old. "There's pizza money on the kitchen counter," she said, leading me through the house. "The kids can stay up until 8, but absolutely no later. They've both had baths already. Emergency numbers are on the refrigerator. We should be home by midnight, maybe a little earlier." She showed me around the house, pointing out where everything was. The kids were in the living room watching cartoons, already in their pajamas. They barely looked up when their mom introduced me, which was typical. Most kids that age are more interested in TV than babysitters. Mr. Morrison came downstairs adjusting his tie. He was a big man, probably 6'4", with the kind of presence that filled a room. He worked in finance and always seemed like he took everything very seriously. "Mandy, right," he said, shaking my hand. "Thanks for coming on short notice. The kids should be easy tonight. They had a big day at school." The parents spent another 10 minutes going over instructions, checking that I had their cell phone numbers and reminding me about bedtime. Finally, they kissed the kids goodbye and left, their car disappearing down the long driveway into the darkness. For the first hour, everything was completely normal. I ordered pizza, let the kids eat in front of the TV, and listened to them chatter about their friends at school. They were good kids, polite, funny, and clearly loved by their parents. Emma was the more talkative one, always asking questions about everything. Ethan was quieter, but had this mischievous smile that told you he was always thinking about something. At exactly 8 o'clock, I announced bedtime. The kids groaned but didn't argue too much. I followed them upstairs to their bedrooms, which were right next to each other at the end of a long hallway. Emma's room was all pink and purple, with stuffed animals covering every surface. Ethan's was decorated with superhero posters and Lego constructions. I tucked Emma in first. She wanted me to read her a story, so I grabbed a book from her shelf and read about a princess who saved her kingdom from a dragon. When I finished, she asked me to check her closet for monsters. I opened the door and made a big show of looking around, declaring it completely monster-free. "What about under the bed?" she asked. I got down on my hands and knees and looked under her bed. Nothing but a few dust bunnies and a forgotten sock. "All clear," I announced. "No monsters anywhere." I went to Ethan's room next. He was already under his covers, but his eyes were wide open. "I don't want to go to sleep yet," he said. "Your parents said 8 o'clock, I reminded him. "It's already past that. But I'm not tired. Can I stay up a little longer? Please?" I sat on the edge of his bed. "What's wrong? Are you worried about something?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sometimes I hear things at night. In the walls." "What kind of things?" "Like scratching, and sometimes it sounds like someone walking around in the attic." I smiled reassuringly. Old houses make lots of noises, especially at night when everything is quiet. It's probably just the heat coming on, or maybe some mice in the walls, nothing to be scared of. But what if it's not mice? Then it's probably squirrels or raccoons. They sometimes get into attics, but your dad would take care of it if there were animals up there. This seemed to satisfy him. He closed his eyes and was asleep within minutes. I went back downstairs and settled into the living room with my textbook. I had a psychology exam coming up and figured I could get some studying done while the kids slept. The house was quiet except for the usual sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the old wood settling. Around 9:30, I heard something that made me look up from my book. It sounded like footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway outside the kids' rooms. I set down my book and listened carefully. Nothing. Just silence. One of the kids must have gotten up to use the bathroom. I waited a few minutes, expecting to hear a toilet flush or water running, but there was nothing. No sounds at all from upstairs. I decided to check on them. I climbed the stairs quietly, not wanting to wake them if they were still asleep. Both bedroom doors were closed, just as I'd left them. I cracked Emma's door open and peered inside. She was sound asleep, curled up with her favorite stuffed elephant. Ethan's room was the same. He was lying on his side, breathing deeply and peacefully. Both kids were exactly where they should be. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. The house was completely quiet now. I must have imagined the footsteps, or maybe it was just the old house settling like I'd told Ethan. I went back downstairs and tried to focus on my studying, but I felt unsettled. There was something about the silence that didn't feel right. It was too complete, too heavy. I found myself looking up at the ceiling every few minutes, listening for any sound from upstairs. Around 10 o'clock, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were definitely coming from the second floor, and they were moving slowly from one end of the hallway to the other. I muted the TV and listened intently. The footsteps stopped directly above where I was sitting. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold, a door creaking open. I rushed upstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time. Both kids' bedroom doors were still closed, exactly as I'd left them. I checked on Emma first, still asleep, then Ethan, also asleep. But now I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the end of the hallway, past the kids' rooms, there was another door. It was slightly ajar when I was sure it had been closed earlier. I approached it slowly. Behind the door was a narrow staircase leading up to what must have been the 3rd floor. The attic, the space Ethan had mentioned hearing noises from. The staircase was dark, and I couldn't see anything beyond the first few steps. I reached for a light switch and found one at the bottom of the stairs. I flipped it on. The staircase was illuminated, showing old wooden steps leading up to a small landing. From where I stood, I could see part of what looked like a storage area. Boxes, old furniture, the usual attic stuff. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding. The attic was larger than I'd expected, running the full length of the house. It was filled with the accumulated junk of decades, Christmas decorations, old clothes, furniture covered in sheets, boxes labeled with years and contents. Everything looked normal, but something felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet, and there was a smell I couldn't identify. Musty, but with something else underneath it, something that reminded me of wet clothes. I was about to leave when I heard something that made me freeze. A soft thud, like something heavy being set down carefully. It came from the far end of the attic, behind a wall of stacked boxes. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and shaky in the large space. "Is someone there?" No response. Just that oppressive silence. I started moving toward the sound, stepping carefully around boxes and furniture. As I got closer to the far end of the attic, I could see that someone had created a small space behind the boxes, like a little room or hiding place. The smell was stronger here, not just musty. There was definitely something else, something organic and unpleasant. I moved one of the boxes aside and peered into the hidden space. What I saw made me stumble backward, knocking over a stack of old books. Someone had been living in the attic. There was a sleeping bag on the floor, along with empty food containers, water bottles, and what looked like weeks' worth of trash. Worse, there were photographs scattered around, photographs of the Morrison family taken from outside their house. Pictures of the kids playing in the yard, Mr. and Mrs. Morrison coming and going, even shots taken through windows into the house. And there were pictures of me, photos taken tonight, showing me arriving at the house, playing with the kids, tucking them into bed. Someone had been watching us all evening. I grabbed my phone and started to dial 911, but before I could hit send, I heard something that made my heart stop. The sound of the attic door closing downstairs, then footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming up toward where I was standing. I looked around frantically for another way out, but there was nowhere to go. The attic had no other exits, no windows large enough to climb through. I was trapped. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. I could see a shadow moving in the main part of the attic, slowly making its way toward the back where I was hidden. I crouched down behind a stack of boxes, trying to make myself as small as possible. My phone was still in my hand, but I was afraid to call for help because whoever was up there would hear me talking. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a voice, a man's voice, low and raspy. "I know you're back there," he said. "I saw you go behind the boxes. There's no point in hiding." I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. Maybe if I didn't move, he'd think I'd found another way out. "I've been watching this family for months," he continued, his voice getting closer. "I know everything about them, their schedules, their habits, when they're home and when they're not. I know about their babysitters, too." I could hear him moving boxes around, getting closer to where I was hiding. "You're not the first one, you know. There was another girl before you. Sarah, I think her name was. She found my little space up here, too. We had a nice long talk about keeping secrets." My mind raced. Sarah Morrison had mentioned that their previous babysitter had quit suddenly and wouldn't give a reason. They'd seemed puzzled by it, but I'd assumed it was just a scheduling conflict or something. "Sarah was smart," the voice continued. "She understood that some things are better left alone. I hope you're as smart as she was." He was only a few feet away now. I could see his shadow moving across the floor. In a few seconds, he'd be close enough to see me. I made a split-second decision. Instead of waiting to be found, I stood up and faced him. He was a middle-aged man, maybe 45 or 50, with greasy hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He was thin but tall, with the kind of wiry build that suggested he was stronger than he looked. What scared me most were his eyes. They were too bright, too intense, like he was seeing things the rest of us couldn't see. "There you are," he said, smiling. "I was wondering when you'd stop hiding." "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just to talk, same as I talked to Sarah, same as I've talked to the others." "Others?" "This isn't the only house I visit. There are lots of families in this neighborhood, lots of opportunities to observe." He took a step closer, and I could smell him now. Unwashed clothes, stale food, and something else that made my stomach turn. "The thing is," he said, "families like the Morrisons don't like to know they're being watched. It upsets them, makes them call the police, install security systems, disrupt the natural order of things." "You can't just live in people's houses without permission," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "But I'm not living in their house," he replied. "I'm living above it, in space they don't use, don't think about. I'm like a ghost. I watch, I observe, but I don't interfere. Usually." "What do you mean, usually?" His smile widened. "Sometimes I have to make sure people understand the importance of keeping quiet, of not disrupting the arrangement." That's when I realized he wasn't just some homeless person who'd found a place to stay. He was dangerous. Potentially very dangerous. I started backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The attic space was narrow, and he was between me and the stairs. "Sarah understood," he said, following my movement. "After we talked, she quit her job here and never came back. She never told the Morrisons what she'd found up here. Very smart girl. What did you do to her? Nothing permanent. Just helped her understand the consequences of making trouble for me. I was running out of options. The man was blocking my only exit, and I had no way to call for help without him hearing me. But I had to try something. The kids, I said suddenly. What about Emma and Ethan? They're just children. His expression changed slightly. I would never hurt children. I'm not a monster. I just observe, learn about families, see how they live when they think no one is watching. But you're scaring them. Ethan told me he hears noises at night. Children have active imaginations. A few small sounds never hurt anyone. I realized he genuinely believed what he was saying. In his mind, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just living his life, and the fact that it was in other people's houses without their knowledge was just a detail. Look, I said, I don't want any trouble. I just want to go back downstairs and finish my job. The kids' parents will be home soon. No, they won't, he said. They're at the Hendersons' wedding reception. Those things go late. They won't be back until after midnight, maybe later. The fact that he knew exactly where the Morrisons were and when they'd be back made my skin crawl. He'd been watching them so closely that he knew their schedule better than I did. What do you want from me? I asked. The same thing I wanted from Sarah. An understanding. You go back downstairs, you finish your babysitting job, you collect your money, and you leave. You never mention what you found up here. You never come back to this house, and most importantly, you never tell anyone about me. And if I don't agree? His smile disappeared. Then we'll have to explore other options. Options that might not be as pleasant for you. I nodded slowly, trying to buy myself time to think. Okay, I understand. I won't say anything. Good, but I need to make sure you really understand. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. Not a big knife, but big enough to do serious damage. He didn't point it at me or make any threatening gestures with it. He just held it where I could see it. This is what I showed Sarah, he said, just so she understood that keeping quiet was in her best interest. I never had to use it, and I hope I never will, but it's important that you know it's there. I nodded again, my mouth too dry to speak. Now I'm going to let you go back downstairs. You're going to act like nothing happened. When the parents get home, you're going to tell them everything was fine. The kids slept through the night, no problems at all. Okay. And Mandy? He knew my name. Of course he did. He'd been watching the house, listening to conversations. This is the last time you'll babysit for the Morrisons. You're going to call them tomorrow and tell them you can't work for them anymore. Schedule conflict, found a different job, whatever excuse you want, but you're never coming back here. I nodded one more time. Good girl, now go. He stepped aside, giving me just enough room to squeeze past him and get to the stairs. I walked slowly, fighting every instinct that told me to run. If I panicked, if I made him think I might cause trouble, he might change his mind about letting me go. I made it to the stairs and started down, my legs shaking so badly I had to hold onto the railing. Behind me, I could hear him moving around in the attic, probably rearranging his hiding place. I reached the second floor and closed the attic door behind me. Then I ran to the bathroom and locked myself inside. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, trying to stop shaking, trying to figure out what to do. I could call the police. But what would I tell them? That there was a man living in the attic who had threatened me but hadn't actually hurt me? What if they didn't believe me? What if they did believe me but couldn't find him? He'd know I'd called them, and then what would happen? I thought about calling the Morrisons, but what would that accomplish? They were at a wedding reception, probably having a good time. Even if they came home immediately, the man would hear them arrive and could easily disappear before they could catch him. I thought about grabbing the kids and leaving, but where would I go? I didn't have a car. My mom had dropped me off, and I couldn't call her to pick me up without explaining why, which would mean telling her about the man in the attic. I was trapped, not physically, but practically. Any action I took would either put me in more danger or drag innocent people into a situation they weren't prepared for. I stayed in the bathroom for almost an hour, trying to calm down and think clearly. Finally, I decided the safest course of action was to do exactly what the man had told me to do. Finish the babysitting job, act like nothing had happened, and deal with the larger problem later when I was somewhere safe. I went back downstairs and tried to focus on my homework, but I couldn't concentrate. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the house made me look up at the ceiling, wondering if he was moving around up there. Around 11:30, I heard a car in the driveway. The Morrisons were home early. I felt a surge of relief, but also terror. What if the man thought I'd called them? What if he was angry that they'd come home before expected? I met them at the door, trying to look normal and relaxed. "How did everything go?" Mrs. Morrison asked, hanging up her coat. "Great," I said, forcing a smile. "The kids were perfect. They went to bed right at 8 and slept through the night." "No problems at all?" Mr. Morrison asked. "None. They were really good." Mrs. Morrison went upstairs to check on the kids while Mr. Morrison paid me. "Same time next week?" he asked. This was my chance. I could tell him about the man in the attic. I could explain what had happened and let him handle it, but then I remembered the knife and the way the man had talked about other options if I didn't cooperate. "Actually," I said, "I don't think I can do next week. I just got a new job and the schedule is going to be really demanding." He looked disappointed but understanding. "Well, if your schedule ever frees up, give us a call. You're great with the kids." Mrs. Morrison came back downstairs. "They're both sound asleep," she said. "Angels." They offered to drive me home, but I told them my mom was already on her way. I called her from their phone and waited outside until she arrived, not wanting to spend another minute in that house. The ride home was torture. My mom kept asking about my evening, and I had to make up cheerful stories about the kids and act like everything had been normal. All I wanted was to get home, lock my bedroom door, and try to process what had happened. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, heard his voice talking about watching families and keeping secrets. I kept thinking about those photographs scattered around his makeshift bedroom, especially the ones of me taken that evening. The next morning, I called the Morrisons and left a message saying I couldn't babysit for them anymore. I gave them the excuse about a scheduling conflict, just like the man had told me to do, but I couldn't let it go. That man was still living in their attic, still watching their family, still taking pictures of their children. The Morrisons had no idea they were being watched in their own home. I decided to call the police. I was terrified of what might happen if the man found out, but I couldn't live with myself if something happened to that family because I'd stayed quiet. I met with a detective at the police station and told him everything. He took my statement seriously and assured me they'd investigate immediately. He also arranged for extra patrols near my house just in case. The police went to the Morrison house that afternoon while the parents were at work and the kids were at school. They found the attic exactly as I'd described it. The makeshift bedroom, the photographs, the evidence of someone having lived there for months. But the man was gone. He'd cleared out sometime between when I'd left the house and when the police arrived. They found no fingerprints, no DNA, no way to identify who he was or where he'd gone. The Morrisons were horrified to learn what had been happening in their own home. They immediately had the attic secured and installed a comprehensive security system. They also made sure to thank me for having the courage to report what I'd found. But the story doesn't end there. 2 weeks later, I got a phone call. When I answered, no one spoke, but I could hear breathing on the other end. Then, just before the line went dead, I heard a familiar voice say, "You didn't keep your promise, Mandy." I changed my phone number the next day. I also asked my parents if I could transfer to a different college in another state. I told them I wanted a change of scenery, but really I just wanted to get as far away as possible from that man and whatever plans he might have for me. I never babysat again. I couldn't. Every time I thought about being alone in someone else's house, responsible for their children, I remembered that night in the Morrison attic. The police never caught him. For all I know, he's still out there, finding new families to watch, new attics to hide in. Sometimes I wonder if he's watching me, even now, if he followed me when I moved, if he's found out where I live. I've never told anyone the complete story before now. Not my parents, not my friends, not even the therapist I saw for a while after it happened. I was afraid that talking about it would somehow make it real again, would remind him that I was out there somewhere, but I realized that staying silent isn't protecting me. It's protecting him. It's allowing him to continue doing what he was doing to other families. If you're reading this and you have children, please check your attic, check your basement, check any spaces in your house that you don't use regularly. Make sure you know who has access to your home and when. And if you're a young person who babysits or works in other people's homes, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if you hear noises that don't make sense, if you feel like you're being watched, investigate. Don't assume you're imagining things. The man I encountered wasn't just a harmless voyeur. He was someone who had spent months planning, watching, learning about a family's most intimate routines. He had photographs of children. He had a knife. He had a system for keeping people quiet. I don't know what he might have done if I hadn't found him when I did. I don't know what he was planning or how long he intended to stay. All I know is that the Morrison family is safe now, and maybe by telling this story, I can help keep other families safe too. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that night. I dream that I'm back in the attic, trapped behind those boxes, listening to footsteps getting closer and closer. But then I remember that I got out. I survived. I found the courage to report what happened, despite being terrified of the consequences. The Morrisons never had any more problems after that night. Their security system works perfectly, and they've never found any evidence of anyone trying to get into their house. Emma and Ethan are doing well in school and haven't mentioned hearing any strange noises at night. I'm doing well too. I finished college, got a good job, and learned to sleep through the night again. I still check my locks twice before bed, and I'll probably always be more cautious about home security than most people. But I'm not going to let one terrifying experience ruin my life. The most important thing I learned from this experience is that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who seem almost normal. The man in the attic wasn't some supernatural creature or obviously dangerous criminal. He was just someone who had convinced himself that what he was doing was acceptable, who had found a way to justify violating other people's privacy and safety. Those are the monsters we need to be most afraid of. The ones who hide in plain sight, who find ways to access our lives without our knowledge, who convince themselves that their actions are harmless when they're anything but. I hope I never have to deal with anything like this again, but if I do, I know I have the strength to handle it, and I know that keeping quiet is never the answer, no matter how scary the alternative might seem. If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, remember, you're not alone. There are people who will believe you, people who will help you, people who will take action to keep you safe. Don't let anyone convince you that staying silent is your only option. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth, even when you're terrified of what might happen next.